When I speak to people about antinatalism, a lot of them say that because most people enjoy their lives, that means it's okay to bring a new person into this world because they will likely enjoy their life as well. And this has never made sense to me. And I've broken it down into 3 reasons that I think this makes no sense and it isn't a justification to create a new person. If we just accept, if we don't look at the data, but we just accept, okay, let's accept for the sake of argument, most people do enjoy their lives and they're glad they were born. I still don't think that is a reason to create a new person. And I'm going to go into those reasons today. So the first reason I think this isn't a good justification is because I think people generally, and this includes all of those people who would say they're glad to be born, I think people are not fully appreciating the counterfactual scenario when they simply would just never have existed. And I think this skews their judgment. So when thinking about not being born, I actually think people are thinking of 2 other scenarios. And before I go into these 2 reasons, I think this is very understandable. Like, people are not used to thinking in this way about an alternate universe where they were never born and stuff like this. So I can get why people are not accurately sort of mulling over this idea in their head. So the first scenario I think people are thinking of is if they weren't born, they would somehow exist in some other weird state where they're like looking down on Earth, watching everyone else live their lives, and they would have this feeling of missing out. Obviously, this is completely inaccurate. Like, they just wouldn't exist on any level. There would be no one to have that feeling of missing out. And the other inaccurate scenario I think people put themselves in is instead of not being brought into existence, they imagine themselves actually being taken out of existence, which is obviously completely different. Never being brought into existence, there would be no one to have any desire or anything like this. But once you're in existence, you have this innate desire to continue living. You have interest, you have relationships, everything like this. So being taken out of existence is, I see it, very different from being brought into existence. So I think these 2 scenarios that I suspect people are often thinking of rather than the actual scenario we're talking about of never existing cloud their judgment. If they never exist, they simply wouldn't exist on any level. There would be no them to have interests or desires to come into existence. And the reason that people feel that they would be missing out is because they exist now and they have certain preferences to be included, to continue their relationships, stuff like this. But the only reason that feeling of missing out arises is because they have those preferences and you have to exist to have them. So if you were never brought into existence, those preferences simply wouldn't exist and there would be no one to be missing out. Now, maybe one way of trying to get people to accurately think about what never existing would be like is to ask them a question of like, what was the year 1750 like for you? Now, 1750 was obviously several centuries ago, and no one alive today will have existed in 1750. So it's safe to ask this person this. So you ask them this question because clearly they weren't around in this time. They didn't exist at this point in time. And when you ask them this question, they may look back at you in a baffled way because the question wouldn't even make sense. They didn't exist for the year to be anything to them. And they would say this. They would say, well, I didn't exist. The year was neither here or there for me. I just simply didn't exist. And that's the point. That is what all of existence would be like if you never existed. That's what all time would be like. You weren't around to feel like you're missing out on 1750. And I think maybe asking a question like that would make it so that people can make a more rational assessment about answering the question, would it be better to have never existed or to have existed? Because I think people's judgment on this gets emotionally clouded by their attachment to the here and now, to their relationships, their friendships, their hobbies, the items they own, all of this sort of stuff people get attached to. And very understandably, once we exist, we form these attachments, but it clouds our judgment when we think about never existing. So the second reason is that I think we're basically with each generation creating like an Omelas 2.0. If you want to find out what Omelas is, it's a short story by Ursula K. Le Guin, which I talk about in a different video, which I will pop up in one of the corners, so you can check that out after this video. So what I mean by that is with every generation, sure, let's take for the sake of argument that most of them, will enjoy their lives. But there's a minority of people who don't enjoy their lives and go through great hardship. And if we're asked, they may say that they would prefer never to have been created. In each generation, the people who go on to enjoy their lives come at the cost of those people who don't. With each generation, we're creating like an Omelas 2.0, but it's not just one child in a basement suffering, it's millions of people suffering. And it's not to provide everyone with an amazing life, it's to provide everyone else with a mediocre to good life. So we're actually, with each generation, creating a much worse scenario than Omelas. Given that none of these people needed to exist, I don't see a justification for throwing that minority under the bus for the sake of people who never even wanted to exist in the first place. We don't do something wrong by not creating someone who would go on to be glad to have lived, but we do something wrong when we create someone who has an awful life. And the third reason I think this is not a good justification is because I don't think people are reliable judges. And I'm going to break this down into two parts. One, I'm going to talk about like addiction, and the other I'm going to talk about a lack of experience. So starting with addiction. So just because most people enjoy their lives is not a reason to create more people. By way of analogy, many people, when they're hooked up on drugs, say that they enjoy it and want to continue it. But this doesn't mean that we should be going around and actively getting people addicted to those drugs. We recognize that their stated preference may actually not lead to the best set of circumstances. And we realize that their judgment is clouded. It's just so normal for us to be hooked on these things we call pleasure and satisfaction that it's not recognized as an addiction. I mean, it's understandable. There's 4.5 billion years of evolution gone into this. And if we don't put active effort into feeding this addiction, then we're at risk of great suffering and ultimately death as well. And some people have likened the statement to, oh, well, I'm glad to have been born, as a form of Stockholm syndrome, where we just become attached to this idea of chasing pleasure and satisfaction at the risk of suffering and death, and don't realize how abusive that sort of scenario is that we've been put into. And then the second point on this unreliable judge's point is about a lack of experience. So most people who would answer this question are only part of the way through their lives. They haven't experienced everything yet. And by definition, everyone who answers this question has not gone through the dying process. And so the people who are making these statements are making them based on incomplete experience, incomplete understanding. And that's an incomplete understanding and experience of their own life, let alone someone else's life, the person that they would go on to create. So this seems like extremely shaky ground to create someone else and expose them to something that you don't even fully understand yet. Anyway, so those are the three reasons why I think saying most people enjoy their lives is really not a good reason to create a new person. Like, it's amazing for those people that they do, like, very happy for them, but creating a new person is a completely different ballpark. And I think those three reasons sort of capture why that's not a good justification. But let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.